Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So, I hope you'll bear with me this week. I've actually got a fairly bad cold, or maybe a small case of the flu. I've got congestion, feel achy and cold and everything like that. But I'm going to try and muddle through this episode nonetheless, so hopefully it works out fine. I may not be quite at my best, but I'll do what I can. So this week I'm going to talk about Alvin Plantinga's Evolutionary Argument against Naturalism because I think it ties in pretty nice and neatly. It's quite related to topics of evolution, science, and creation for pretty obvious reasons. And I really like this argument. I came across it a number of years ago, probably, I want to say 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago, before I was formally studying philosophy, and at the time thought, wow, this is easily one of the cleverest things I've ever heard anybody articulate. And now, after studying philosophy formally, writing my own thesis, presenting at conferences, and thinking about these things, well, I'm still pretty well convinced it's one of the cleverest things that I've ever heard anybody articulate. So I want to do a whole episode on this argument here. But before I do that, I want to give out another Facepalm and Sigh Award, because I really enjoy doing those too. So this Facepalm and Sigh Award goes to Megan Waltern. Again, I'm just terrible at mispronouncing names. That's kind of a staple of this program by now, I assume. Also a staple is I'm drinking a cup of coffee. I actually had a gentleman send me a message just yesterday where he was going through praising some of the episodes I've did, and then at the end of it said, "And keep drinking your coffee." So here I go, drinking more coffee and doing the episode. So anyhow, Megan Waltern is a reviewer and a writer over at CNET. Now CNET is a pretty popular and I think very widely well-known website that does reviews of tech products. I've used them many times when I'm looking at, should I get this type of TV, this type of laptop? And they tend to be pretty good as far as testing these things and letting you know their features, their downsides, and things like that. I've consulted CNET many times and found them to be pretty helpful. So anyhow, she was reviewing the Facebook Portal TV, and the headline of her article is, "No one should buy the Facebook Portal TV." And she says at the start, the byline is, "In 6 years of testing tech, this is a first for me." And I'll just read through some of the stuff she talks about here. "When I first sat down to write this article, I struggled a lot. Reviewing products is one of my main roles at CNET, and yet I have no nuanced words about Facebook Portal TV. Don't buy it is all I could and can come up with." And she talks about how she ditched her own Facebook account a while back. She says, like so many other folks, I read about Cambridge Analytica and the other ways the social media giant had misused user data, but the headlines surrounding Facebook are still pretty bleak. More recently, Facebook has been in the news now for how it handles fact-checking of political ads. Presidential hopeful Senator Elizabeth Warren posted her own false ad. Screenwriter Aaron Sorkin chimed in on Facebook's policy on political ads in an open letter to the CEO. Sorkin said, "Every square inch of that is a lie, and it's under your logo." Sorkin wrote regarding a Trump campaign ad on Facebook aimed at the presidential candidate Joe Biden that contained misinformation. He claimed that's not defending free speech, that's assaulting the truth. Some have called for Facebook to join with Twitter and stop displaying political ads, but the Facebook COO has defended the decision to keep them up. And going on and going on and going on, and she carries on and on and on for quite a while about how she does not like Facebook's policies, procedures, and how they do things as far as political ads, free speech, and other related issues. If you follow politics at all, it's a pretty standard liberal or leftist-leaning talking points against Facebook. And so she then concludes, at least this section of the article, saying, "In short, there's way too much going on with Facebook to recommend me sticking its latest round of camera-equipped portal devices in their homes." And then she talks about how, she says, quote, 99.9999% of products I have trouble recommending have issues related to the products themselves that are hard to overlook. They don't perform well, they cost too much, they have a weird app, etc., etc. And then she goes on to explain, I can't get there with Facebook Portal TV. It's a complete anomaly. A solid performing, decently priced device that just isn't suited for anyone because of the privacy concerns and increasing alarming issues plaguing the social network site. And then she goes on and talks about what she she has a section titled The Anti-Review, where she actually talks about the real technical capabilities and what this Facebook Portal TV can actually do, and more or less says, well, it does pretty much exactly what they say it's going to do, and it seems to do it reasonably well, but I don't recommend it for all these other reasons. And now, don't take this in any way as a recommendation for me to get Facebook Portal, either the TV or another version. I remember thinking when I first saw advertisements for that probably like 6 months or a year ago, well, what's the point of this? I think I said to my wife, why would you go pay money for a device that can do video chat when probably 80% or better of us can get that option for free on your phone? You can do it for free on an iPhone, and there's apps that let you do it for free on Android phones as well. So why go pay money for that when you can just get it for free? I genuinely don't understand. And further, also, don't take this as an endorsement of Facebook. Facebook has a lot of policies and procedures that I think are pretty wrong-headed and pretty biased and show that they're generally not looking out for the consumers and people who actually use Facebook. I mean, I still use Facebook myself to keep in contact with people and promote this podcast and a few other things like that. But realistically, if there was another company that would enable me to do more or less the same thing, I'd probably be pretty eager to jump ship because I'm not really a big fan of theirs either. And that said, even though I kind of disagree with the talking points against Facebook here, I think they're actually taking a good stand for a change when they're standing for free speech as far as political ads and things like that go. I think it's a step in the right direction after very many steps in the wrong direction. I'm not necessarily here saying that it's wrong for Megan Walton to criticize Facebook for the policies and procedures they have that she doesn't like. If that was an editorial on a different webpage or an editorial even on CNET about Facebook's practices or something like that, or an opinion piece or something like that, again, that'd be perfectly fine. The problem here is that she essentially says at the end of this review, which is not really a review, more or less, yeah, Facebook's Portal TV performs pretty much exactly as advertised. If you buy it, you're going to get what they claim you're going to get. But then she doesn't recommend it because she doesn't like the company. In a certain sense, what she's doing here is bringing in a complete red herring. She's starting the article with a red herring about how, well, Facebook is a terrible company according to me, therefore you shouldn't buy their product, even though it performs pretty much exactly as advertised. She says it works fine, it does what it's supposed to do. Well, that's really not the point of doing a tech review. The tech review should, in a certain sense, be, hey, does this product work as advertised? Is it too much money? Does it have technical problems, or does it do what they say it's going to do? And then the editorial stuff, her editorializing about how Facebook is a terrible company, well, that really doesn't have anything to do with how well the product performs. It doesn't have anything to do with the review. Now, again, I think you can make a decent case that if you think Facebook's a bad company, you shouldn't buy their products. But this is I would say, analogous to how there are now some movie reviewers who will tell you things like, well, don't go see that movie because it has this one actor in it who did these terrible things. Which realistically would mean you probably should never see a movie made by anyone in Hollywood ever again, because anybody who pays attention knows if you go to Hollywood, throw a rock, you'll probably hit two people who've done some pretty unscrupulous and awful things, because that's how the industry there works. But some people apply this kind of hypocritically and uncritically and say, well, hey, you don't go see this particular movie because of these awful things this person did. And in fact, you're now seeing many people who make movies try and co-opt this by refusing to hire people who they think are a bridge too far. I went and saw the recent Predators movie over this last summer, which wasn't a terribly good movie, but apparently there was a scene in it that got cut before theatrical release because the director had hired a friend of his to play one character for a 5-minute scene, and then found out later that there was some allegations of sexual abuse in this guy's past, or he'd been convicted of it. I don't really remember the details. The point being, the director cut that scene out of the movie before releasing the movie because of these allegations or the guy's convictions. And in actuality, it made parts of the movie not make sense, because it was now missing a scene that contained some key explanations for other things that were going on later. And so what Megan is doing here is very, very similar, where she's saying, no, Facebook is a bad company, therefore I can't recommend you buy their products. And that's a complete red herring on what a tech review should be. It shouldn't be about, is this a bad company or is this a good company? It should be about, well, does this product perform according to standards and is it as advertised? Realistically speaking, any major corporation, you can find things they are doing that you disagree with and think are wrong. You buy products from Apple, a lot of those are made in foreign countries by child labor, and a lot of the rare metal components are mined by people who are engaging in child labor and putting their workers in horrible conditions. Does that mean you shouldn't buy Apple products? Well, maybe. That's a pretty interesting moral question, and I respect people who say, no, that means you shouldn't. But does that question in and of itself have anything to do with, is the iPhone 11 a good phone? Does it perform as advertised? Well, no. And so maybe a red herring isn't exactly the best way to describe this type of error. It's more kind of a politics creep where people's political viewpoints are now so influencing everything that you can't even read what's supposed to be a tech review about Facebook Portal TV without getting into the politics and murkiness of the situation. And I think we as a society and culture would be a whole lot better served if there were still a lot of places that weren't snapped up by politics. If you could still go to CNET and read a tech review that was actually just a tech review, and then hopefully you would also be an informed and well enough consumer that you would be keeping up with, well, what is Facebook like as a company? Are they somebody who I do want to send my money to? Because that's a legitimate thing to do as well. If you don't like Facebook, you don't have to buy their products or be on Facebook. And there are people who've gotten off it for various reasons, and I can respect that. And the larger problem here with this creep of politics into everything, including tech reviews and stuff like, and movie reviews and so many other aspects of our culture, is that it essentially forces everybody to be hypocrites. And what I mean by that is, we are all very much consumers in our society. We engage in commerce every day. When you buy food, when you buy gas, when you buy a new computer, when you do all these various things, you engage in commerce with many different individuals and many different companies. Some of them very, very big companies like Apple and Facebook, and some of them very small ones like a local business that sells you coffee. Like there's a coffee shop here in where I live that I go to and get a cup of coffee from time to time, and I think it's run by a mom and her daughter, and they might have one other employee. So small business there, much different than, say, Facebook. And so the reason why this forces us all to be hypocrites is you inevitably end up applying standards. You have to pick and choose where you apply your standards. Because if you're going to try to hold that, well, every person who I engage in commerce with, they have to agree with me on these and these and these political and ideological points, you're never going to be able to live by that consistently. You interact with too many people and too many systems and too many things as far as commerce goes. So just for example, take a small business like that coffee shop. Well, in theory, I could go there and talk to the mom and daughter and their other employee and make sure they're all in line ethically with the standards I like. But where did they get their material from? Where did they buy their espresso maker from? Where did they buy their coffee beans from? Where did they buy their milk and cream and other such things from? Well, if I was going to be consistent, I'd have to do the same thing with all those producers and so on and so forth. I'd have to do it with not only who their coffee bean supplier is, but then say, well, what about where you get your coffee beans? What about where their milk producer gets their milk? And so on and so forth. And that's just one example of a small coffee shop. All of us engage in far more commerce than that every day. And so this political creep makes us all hypocrites by saying, oh, I can't engage in commerce with Facebook because of what an evil company they are, but I'm ignoring all these other cases where I'm buying things from people who I think are evil, or engaging in commerce with this company that does this other stuff. It's gotten to the point where economics is so interconnected nowadays that it's virtually impossible for you to actually go through and verify that everything you're purchasing from everybody and everyone you're engaging in commerce with actually meets whatever ethical standards you have. It just can't be done. It's too complicated. You could spend 20 hours a day going through looking it all up, and you'd still probably wouldn't come out correct. Now, I know there's a big movement in society and culture right now to make things ethically sourced and to only buy from responsible companies that behave in ethical ways and things along those lines. And I'm not saying that's bad. It's always better when people behave more ethically and companies behave more ethically. What I'm saying is holding a standard that says, Facebook does political things I disagree with, therefore I'm not going to engage in commerce with them, forces you to inconsistency. Because I can promise you, if we actually went through and looked at who you engage in commerce with, you'd find dozens of other places where these people have similar political stances to what Facebook does, and you engage in commerce with them. So you have to be inconsistent. And again, this isn't to say that you can't pick and choose who you want to behave, who you want to engage in commerce with for whatever reason you want. That's the difference between a free society and a not free one. What I'm suggesting is when you let this political creep into everything and say it's because of my politics and my ideology that I won't engage in commerce with those people. It's because of my politics and my ideology that I won't go buy a cake from that Christian baker who didn't sell to gay people, or because of my politics and my ideology that I won't go buy gas from that gas station where the attendant is a Muslim who wears a turban or something like that. Well, you've forced yourself to be inconsistent at that point, and we should all do our best to avoid inconsistency. And so maybe calling it a red herring isn't quite the best way to give out this facepalm and sigh award. It's more a fallacy of bringing politics into everything. But it was just such an obvious, egregious example where politics really just doesn't have a place and shouldn't have a place in a tech review. And pretty much everybody who's reasonable, I think, should agree with that. So for that reason, I'm giving Megan Woltern the facepalm and sigh award because politics doesn't have a place in a tech review. For goodness sakes, just tell us if the item works well or not. Finish your tech review, and then if you're really passionate about it, write an editorial about how you think Facebook is a bad company and get it posted somewhere else. Or start an editorial page on CNET where you can put there and say, yeah, it's a good, and then say in your editorial, yeah, it's a fine product, but you shouldn't buy from Facebook, and here's why. Well, that probably went on a little longer than it should have, but as I've often done before, I picked that facepalm and sigh award in part because it gave me an excuse to talk about all these issues and how political creep forces us all to be hypocrites, so we should resist and avoid that if we can. Okay, moving quickly, as quick as I can anyway, on to the evolutionary argument against naturalism. This argument was first proposed by Alvin Plantinga. It's gone through a couple of different iterations. If you want to hear him present it, you can just go to YouTube and type in the evolutionary argument against naturalism. There's a couple of videos of people explaining it, a couple of lectures where he talked about it and presented it in his own words. And I think the most recent version of it he gave is actually at the end of his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. So if you want to look at it in more detail, go there. Now, virtually everything I'll be saying here is actually me taking Plantinga's argument and his presentation of his own argument and just kind of redoing it in my own words. So very, very little of this, if any, is actually going to be original to me. All credit here goes to Alvin Plantinga for developing this very interesting and, I think, fantastic argument. So the common conception in popular culture is that atheism and evolution really go hand in hand. And naturalism is not quite atheism. It's more, Plantinga uses the term high-grade atheism. Naturalism is the idea that not only there or no God, but there's not anything like him at all. So, what if we just, for the sake of argument, were to grant the idea that both naturalism and evolution are true? Well, what would follow from that? Well, Plantinga actually argues that these two ideas together become self-referentially incoherent. That is, they're self-refuting. Now, this is different than and much worse than strictly a contradiction. I talked a bit about what it means for something to be self-refuting in last week's episode on scientism, where J.P. Moreland gave us examples of how scientism in its strong forms is self-refuting. It's self-refuting to say the only things that are true are things that can be proven by the scientific method, because that statement itself cannot be proven by the scientific method. So what Plantinga is saying here is when you stick naturalism and evolution together and you believe both of them, you wind up with something similar to that. You wind up with something that's self-refuting. It's incoherent. It's akin to sitting in a branch on a tree, taking the saw and sawing the branch off that you're sitting on, and then falling to the ground and wondering, well, what happened? Now, the evolutionary argument against naturalism is not quite strictly a metaphysical argument, but it is asking you to step outside the framework of considering if both evolution and naturalism are true, and look at what would it be entailed by that, what comes of that. And so having some sense of metaphysics will probably help you see the point here, and that's why I tried to go through an introduction to metaphysics 2 weeks ago, because most of the objections I've heard to this completely miss the point of the argument, because if you're not used to doing that, you're not used to trying to step outside a framework and consider the whole, it could be kind of hard to follow his argument. I would say this is probably one of the most difficult to follow arguments I've tried to go over here. The only one that's worse is the ontological argument. But here I'm pretty convinced that it's not because Plantinga's argument is in and of itself difficult to understand or see the point of. It's because people just aren't typically accustomed to thinking in this way. And so hopefully if you listen to that episode on metaphysics, that'll help you a little bit. So here Plantinga is defining evolution as basically neo-Darwinism. It's the idea that all species we see on the Earth arise because of mutation and then natural selection acting on those mutations. And so it started, nobody knows exactly how long ago, billion, maybe 2 billion years ago, with some very simple life. And then mutation came in, natural selection acted on those mutations, and eventually you get people, bats, dogs, whales, lizards, birds, and everything else we see, including the plants. Now, naturalism is actually technically a stronger claim than atheism. Naturalism entails atheism, but you don't need to be a naturalist if you're an atheist. Atheism is, of course, the claim that there is no God. Well, naturalism, Plantinga defines it as the claim that not only is there no God, but there's nothing like him at all. So, just for example, you can be a Platonist and also an atheist, but not a naturalist. That's because you could believe in Platonic forms, and if you want to know more about that, I gave a brief introduction to Plato at the end of episode 31 a while ago. But the idea here is, if Platonic forms, in a certain sense, can kind of function like a divine thing. They can function as a goal or a teleology in the world, and you could, at least in theory, believe in those while not believing in God. Same thing if you want to embrace a Hegelian philosophy after Hegel. Hegel kind of thought that there was like a world spirit, or what he termed a Geist, that everything was moving toward, and that's where he gets his thesis and antithesis dichotomy, which you probably heard of, because that's infiltrated its way down to popular culture. And so, even though you could be a Hegelian atheist in the sense of saying there's no God, you wouldn't really be a naturalist if you buy into Hegelian philosophy, because there's something more than just the material world. Naturalism, according to Plantinga, pretty much always is going to entail materialism, the idea that the physical things of the world, the matter, is all there is, and anything else just doesn't exist or is illusionary. Naturalism is that there's no Platonic forms, there's no Hegelian spirit or Geist, there's no God, there is no God, or nothing that's in any way like him. And this idea is kind of encaptured by that famous Carl Sagan quote that the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever will be. That is, the material universe is all there is, was, or ever will be. And he cites Bertrand Russell, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett as other examples of naturalists. He quotes John Lucas as saying that naturalism is the contemporary orthodox of the academy. And in my experience from interacting with people in the academy and philosophy, I would say that's probably correct. I think you're going to find probably less naturalists who are philosophers, because philosophers tend to recognize the problems inherent in certain viewpoints. But if you go to your typical science department at your typical university, there's a high probability that most of the professors there are probably going to be naturalists of one sort or another. So those are the definitions of evolution and naturalism that are being worked from in this sense. And hopefully, at this point, after listening to this series I'm doing on this, you have a pretty good understanding of what naturalism and evolution means here. Now, there's a further term that Plantinga uses in his argument called cognitive faculties. And just loosely speaking, your cognitive faculties are the things through which you perceive the world. These are things like our eyes and other senses. But it's not just your physical senses, it's also your ability to remember things and reason. It's your ability to recall, oh wait, the last time I went outside when it was snowing without a coat, I got cold. I need to put on a coat now. It's also your reason. It's your perception. It's also It's also at least partially your ability to have empathy and look at other people and realize, oh, that person is suffering. I've suffered before too, and that really sucked. That was lame. Maybe I should have some empathy with them. It's your inductive and deductive reasoning, your instincts, your ability to learn things by experience, and so on. And so all these things, they fall under this label that he's using of cognitive faculties. It's your ability to perceive and understand and make sense of the world around you. And so the crux to the argument is that if both evolution and naturalism are true, then it is unlikely that our cognitive faculties would be reliable and give us true beliefs. And so what he's arguing here is essentially that if you accept both naturalism and evolution, then you have what's termed a defeater for the idea that your cognitive faculties are reliable. And since all your beliefs are formed through your cognitive faculties, you then have a defeater for all your beliefs, including your belief in naturalism and evolution. Hence, believing both naturalism and evolution is self-refuting. Now, I'm sure if you haven't heard this argument before and you're not used to thinking in these ways, you're probably going to be like, what? I missed something there. So I'm going to explain this quite a bit more detailed than that. First of all, to explain this, you need to know what a defeater actually is. Now, this is very simple, actually. All a defeater is it's a belief that shows you another belief you have is false. So this is an example I've used before. I might have mentioned it on the podcast here, I'm not sure. But suppose I tell you that I was living in Springfield in 2008. You might think, well, Phil was probably living in Illinois in 2008 then, because Springfield's in Illinois. And then you later heard somebody say to you, well, Phil was living in Missouri in 2008. Well, then you have a defeater for your belief that I lived in Springfield, Illinois in 2008, because there is a Springfield, Missouri. And so you have a defeater for that idea that I was living in Illinois, because it meshes better for me if you heard me say, I live in Springfield, and somebody else said Phil lived in Missouri, for you to think, oh, he just lived in Springfield, Missouri. That's what a defeater is. Or another example would be, suppose you come across a headline on Facebook or somewhere that says something like, so-and-so, this celebrity has died. Say Betty White or the Queen of England has died. And so you click on that and read through that, and then you quickly see, oh, this is one of those fake news, those satire websites, like you see that it's from The Onion or the Babylon Bee or something along those lines. Well, you've now got a defeater for the idea that Betty White or the Queen of England died, because you know those are satirical websites, those are fake news websites. They don't tell you the truth, and at least in the case of The Onion and the Babylon Bee, they don't tell you the truth on purpose just to be funny. So when you saw that initial headline, you formed the belief, this person has died, and then when you followed it through, you realized, oh, I've got a defeater for that belief. I know this website doesn't report true information. And that's really all defeaters are. They're a belief that you can hold that shows you that other beliefs are false. And we come across them all the time when we're learning. It's part of the process of learning and being a better human being, is to come across defeaters and change your mind. Now, under most types of theistic belief, the belief that God exists, they hold that humans are actually made in the image of God, and so, as a consequence of that, we would expect that our cognitive faculties, our perceptions, are going to be at least generally reliable if theism is true. God would have good reasons to give us good or mostly accurate perceptions of the world so we could form true beliefs about him and other people and so on. Thomas Aquinas says some similar things to this, although I can't recall the reference off the top of my head, but loosely speaking, that part of what makes us human is our ability to reason and perceive things, at least mostly correctly. Now, naturally, most of us think that that's at least one of the purposes of our reasons, perceptions, our cognitive faculties, and so on, is to provide us with true belief. This is the very commonsensical and conservative viewpoint of things. My eyes show me that there's a wall in front of me, so I believe that the wall's there, and I don't run into it when I'm running away from things such as fires or maybe chores that I don't want to do around the house. I don't hit the wall because my eyes showed me that it's there, and I can believe it's there, therefore I don't run into it. I open the door or go around it or something. And that's pretty much generally how all these things work when our minds and our perceptions, our cognitive faculties are actually functioning properly. Now, my eyes can actually fail in the sense that, say, I could be blind, and my eyes actually have partially failed. I wear contact lenses or glasses because I can't see very well. My eyes don't work as well as some other people's do, so I have to use contact lenses or glasses to offset that. And other aspects of our perception and faculties can fail as well all the time. People can be deaf. They can go numb and not sense things. People can go insane because their brains don't function quite right. I've actually heard or read it a couple places that maybe part of the reasons why psychopaths don't feel empathy with other people is that there's literally something wrong with their brains, something wrong with their cognitive faculties. There's a Christian philosopher and apologist named David Wood who runs the YouTube channel Act 17 Apologetics, and he's talked a little bit about that on there, about how he's technically a psychopath, and if I remember correctly, he did a video talking about Vincent van Gogh and how was comparing himself to Vincent van Gogh because he was intrigued by the fact that he's unable, or it's very, very difficult for him to feel empathy for other people, where he thinks that Vincent van Gogh felt way too much empathy for other people, and it was an interesting dichotomy. Now, because our cognitive faculties, our perceptions, tend to work when we're functioning properly, that is, we can usually distinguish when that person's insane and when they're sane. We can usually find ways to distinguish when our eyes are seeing things correctly and when they're not, because we have so many senses, so many cognitive faculties, so we can rely on the other ones when one fails. If I'm going blind and I don't see the wall in front of me, well, I'm going to realize it's there when I run into it. I'm going to feel the wall with my sense of touch. So because of this, there's actually a large agreement on most beliefs, at least most baseline beliefs that people have. There's a quote, I don't remember exactly how it goes, from Dallas Willard, where he talks about how most beliefs that most people have are actually true, because most beliefs that most people have are things like, the baby's crying. I should probably do something about that. There's a chair there. A chair is something I can sit in. I'm hungry. Well, food makes me less hungry, and so on and so forth. That's the beliefs that most people have, are very, very basic things like that. Usually when philosophers, we like to talk about belief, we're talking about things like, well, do you believe in abstract objects? Do you believe in nominalism or realism? Do you believe in God? And more high-level abstracted things like that. But most of the beliefs that most people actually hold are very basic things that are obvious. So right now, you believe that you're listening to my podcast. Now, you probably didn't think about it consciously until I just said that, but that's a belief you hold, and as long as you're listening to this podcast, that's a correct belief. And so what I think this shows us is that this is a good sign, at least, a good indicator, a pretty strong evidence in favor of the idea that our cognitive faculties are generally reliable, because most people agree most of the time about basic beliefs about things. For example, I've heard it said that when the Titanic sank, there was actually a lot of disagreement with the witnesses as to whether or not the boat split in part as it was sinking or whether it went down whole. Now later, back in the 80s when they found the wreck, they were able to confirm, it did split in part. But the witnesses disagreed about whether or not it split apart or went down whole. But even though they disagreed, they did actually agree on the deeper beliefs, which is there was a Titanic. It did sink. They agreed about what boats are, what the nature of the boat is. They agreed that there was an ocean there. They agreed that boats can sink in the ocean. They agreed how boats and the water interact in general. They all agreed that people die if they're under the water too long, and so on and so forth. There was a large amount of agreement about the baseline beliefs, and then a disagreement about a higher level or more abstracted belief, which was, did the boat break apart when it was sinking, or did it go down whole? So the common and I think probably right thought is that, generally speaking, when our cognitive faculties are working right, when your eyesight's working right, when your reasoning's working right, when your mind isn't obscured by some genetic abnormality or something else that makes you insane, then all of these things are giving you true beliefs that are generally reliable. Not all the time. I mean, we're all wrong some of the time. But they're generally reliable. That's why you don't walk into walls. That's why when people call your name, you hear them and respond. That's why you can go outside or into your garage and start your car and go to work every day, because you're reasoning properly and your mind is working properly. Your cognitive faculties are generally telling you what the right thing is most of the time, what the true thing is most of the time. Now, this is kind of offhand, but Plantinga actually speculates that maybe our cognitive faculties don't work very well at the far reaches of things like quantum physics, because, and this is me speculating a little bit here, but our minds and senses probably weren't designed to deal with things like the measurement problem in quantum physics, because that's not an environment that we function in on an everyday basis. However, in the environment we almost all function in on a day-to-day basis, our minds, our perceptions, our cognitive faculties do tend to work very well. That's why we're able to go through our lives without dying every day and things like that. Okay, so that's what cognitive faculties are, and at least loosely speaking, why the common sense and conservative view is that they're generally reliable and you can probably trust them. And I also want to add here that with one minor exception, which I'll talk about a little bit later, these definitions of evolution, naturalism, and cognitive faculties are very widely accepted by pretty much all philosophers and people who study these things. These definitions are not really in any serious doubt by pretty much anybody. But now, the problem that comes in is, if we are products of a Darwinian-style evolution, then everything there is about us, all the details that have arisen, all come from an undesigned and purposeless process of blind and impersonal forces. Hence the name of one of Richard Dawkins' books, The Blind Watchmaker. Evolution doesn't really care about you or anyone or anything else. It's just natural selection operating on mutations of some kind. And this natural selection selects for beneficial mutations and weeds out the bad ones. At least that's how the theory goes anyway. So, just for the sake of making it easier to talk about this, if we could assign a purpose to such purposeless things, then what we can say about life under an Darwinian evolutionary theory is that all of it is geared towards survival and reproduction, or perhaps just survival to reproduction. Evolution doesn't really care about what happens to you very much after you pass on your genes, after you reproduce. Everything is geared towards survival and reproduction because that's what it is. That's what natural selection does. But now, if you apply this to human beings, this would also include our cognitive faculties, our perceptions, our eyesight, our senses, our ability to reason, our ability to remember things. All of those would simply be nothing more than something that aids in or enables survival and reproduction. And now there's actually a lot of agreement about this point, surprisingly. That's the reason why people are now doing things like evolutionary psychology, evolutionary sociology, evolutionary anthropology, and so on and so forth. People are attempting to look at all these various elements of human culture and society and view it through a Darwinian evolutionary lens and thinking, well, this aspect of human culture, this aspect of society, if it arose because it enabled survival and reproduction. And so people are now attempting to apply this Darwinian evolutionary framework to a lot of other things just in biology. A good example of this is the popular, I guess he's not quite as popular as he was a year ago, but the popular Canadian psychologist, I think it might be a psychiatrist, I get those confused all the time. Anyhow, Jordan Peterson, you listen to some of his lectures, read his books, he tries to do this. He looks at human society through an evolutionary framework, and he winds up taking what most would call a very conservative perspective that says that, hey, all of these processes by which human beings, we engage in our hierarchies, our dominance behavior, our mating rituals, and so on and so forth, they arose through an evolutionary process that he says is millions and perhaps even 500 or more million years old, because he goes back and looks at how you can find similar behavior in much more primitive animals. And so he's applying an evolutionary framework and saying, this is how we got human society. So the point being, if Darwinian evolution is true, then you'd have to apply that paradigm of natural selection to everything. And that's to some extent what Jordan Peterson and many other people are attempting to do. And you'd have to apply that also to our cognitive faculties, our sight, our perception, our reason, all these other things that we use to perceive and get around the world. They would also be nothing more than something to aid in survival and reproduction. So to help illustrate this, Plantinga uses a quote from the naturalist philosopher Patricia Churchland that is also a little bit funny. And here's what Churchland said. She says, boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. And here Plantinga says, and I quote him verbatim, that's what Churchland says. I'm not responsible for what she says. I'm just the messenger here. That's what she says. So please apply that same thing to me. But Churchland also goes on to explain, The principal chore of nervous systems is to get body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvement in sensorio-motor control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing is advantageous so long as it is geared toward the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So the point that Churchland is driving at there and that Plantinga is driving at is that the purpose under evolutionary theory of cognitive faculties is to get your body where it needs to be to reproduce. And that's it. Everything, every feature about human beings is geared toward that. And you can see that same trend in the other fields of evolutionary psychology, sociology, and so on and so forth. You could even see that same trend in what Jordan Peterson's talking about, although I think he'd disagree with me there. You can kind of look at it through the same sense. Plantinga explains, and here again I'm directly quoting him, natural selection really doesn't care what you believe. Natural selection doesn't select for true beliefs. It doesn't care what you believe. Natural selection cares how you behave in a broad sense of the term behave. It cares what you do, and it cares what your bodily structure is like, and so on. But it doesn't care what you believe. It rewards adaptive behavior and punishes maladaptive behavior. But it doesn't care one way or another about true beliefs. And Darwin actually had a very similar quote or worry about this that he wrote in a letter to one of his friends one time. He said, and again I quote, "With me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has developed from the minds of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" And again, to help you illustrate this, get you thinking in the frame of mind that this is going on, C.S. Lewis said something very, very similar, which has been dubbed the argument from reason. He said, "Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way. This gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading me to atheism, and therefore I have no reason to be an atheist, or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God." And some aspects of Lewis's argument from reason were criticized, and rightly so, by the excellent philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, but at the same time, there's something to the point he's trying to make there, and I hope you can see how all these points that like Darwin, Plantinga, Churchland, and C.S. Lewis are making, they're all kind of driving at the same idea here. And that's the point that if evolutionary theory or something like that is true, and if naturalism is true, if there is no immaterial aspect to the world, then you've got a big problem. Because things like your very sense of reason and your ability to think about the world aren't necessarily going to be conditioned to give you true beliefs. They're going to be conditioned to make you survive and reproduce. And as I'll get into a bit later, it's not necessarily going to be the case that what's true is going to be the best thing for enabling you to survive and reproduce. And now it's about time here that I actually state the argument formally so you can get a even better grasp of what's going on here, but there's just one more idea, distinction, or term I need to explain before I can do that, and you'll understand it. And that's the idea of conditional probability. Now, conditional probability is, again, something that's very easy to understand and grasp, and we all do it in our day-to-day lives, although you probably don't think of it in this formal sense. All it is what's the probability or likelihood of one proposition or idea on the fact of another proposition or idea. So since I've talked about this before on the podcast, and I've argued that we can use inference as the best explanation to demonstrate Christ rose from the dead, well, what's the likelihood that God rose Jesus from the dead on atheism, on the idea that there is no God? Well, it'd be, if not zero, really, really, really low. Whereas, what's the conditional probability that God rose Jesus from the dead on theism, on the idea that God really does exist? Well, it'd be much, much higher, significantly higher. When Plantinga's talking about this, he uses the example of, say, you've got two old men. What's the probability that John will live to 75, given that he's now 30, He's horribly overweight, has a lot of chronic diseases, doesn't watch his diet, and overeats, and has a heart condition. Well, it's probably pretty low. What's the conditional probability that, say, David will live to 75 if David is currently 73, watches his diet like crazy, is extremely healthy, and runs 10 miles every day? Well, it's probably pretty good. And Plantinga uses another example or two, but I hope that you can see the point there. That's all conditional probability is, well, what's the likelihood of this proposition or idea given this other proposition or idea? And that's how we think about things all the time, quite removed from philosophy and evolutionary arguments against naturalism. So, now with all that done, let's put the argument here a little more formally, and again, I'm taking this from Plantinga here. Take R to be the idea that our cognitive faculties are reliable, that they tend to give us the truth, as I spent a lot of time talking about, and take N and E to stand for naturalism and evolution respectively. The formal argument is the conditional property of R given N and E is low, or perhaps quite low. That is, the conditional probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable given naturalism and evolution's truth is low, or quite low. So what Plantinga's attempted to do with this argument here is to agree with Churchland and Darwin, and to a lesser extent C.S. Lewis, that if evolution is true and there is no God or nothing like God to direct the process of evolution toward an end, that is, it's naturalism and not something like Platonism or Hegelian philosophy, then there simply is no reason to think that our beliefs are necessarily true, because the belief-forming systems, that is our cognitive faculties, are geared towards survival and reproduction, and not necessarily truth. There's probably going to be crossover where you're accidentally going to stumble upon true beliefs, but that's not the goal, that's not the purpose behind our cognitive faculties. It's just survival and reproduction. Now, there are many times and instances where believing something false could actually be an aid rather than a detriment to survival and reproduction. As I spent a lot of time talking about, we all naturally just assume that our cognitive faculties are reliable, and generally speaking, rightly so. But put that assumption aside for a few minutes, because what Plantinga is saying is, if evolution and naturalism are true, you can't make that assumption. So put that aside for a second, and just think about these things this way. Now, when Plantinga is giving a lecture on this, he attempts to get us away from this assumption by telling us to think about creatures that are on a different planet. And I think the reason he does this is because this assumption that our faculties are reliable is just so innately ingrained in us that it's difficult to step away from it. So he was probably thinking, hey, if I encourage people to think about creatures on another planet that are like us and show how it works with them, then I can reapply it to people here, and that might work. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and make it as real to you as possible. So here's an easy example that ties into some other stuff I've done on the podcast before. Anxiety is almost always going to be a false belief. That is, the ideas that anxious people have, that everyone is out to get them, that everything's going to go wrong, and so on and so forth. That's almost always a false belief. There are some times where everything does go wrong and people are out to get you, but that's wrong 99% of the time. And if you need more evidence of that, go back and listen to my conversation with J.P. Moreland from a couple of months ago on this subject. But at the same time, anxiety is often going to be a very adaptive belief in the sense of survival and reproduction. If you're very, very anxious and worried that everyone is out to get you, then you're going to take precautions, and then that one time in 100 when somebody actually is out to get you, you're going to have taken precautions and they're not going to get you. Whereas somebody who's not anxious probably didn't take those precautions. And anxiety might drive you into an early grave, like you might die of stress in your late 30s or 40s, but there's plenty of time for you to reproduce after reaching sexual maturity before you're in your 30s or 40s. So anxiety is a false belief, but actually there's a pretty decent chance if you're very anxious, you'll survive long enough to reproduce. It's, as far as evolution and natural selection is concerned, anxiety doesn't really get in its way. In fact, there's instances where being anxious might actually be an aid to survival and reproduction. Or here's a slightly different example. Consider the reasons, that is the beliefs, why somebody might not want to engage in sexual promiscuity, why they might not want to sleep around. Whether you believe you shouldn't sleep around because you believe in a angry, vengeful God who's going to send you to hell for doing so, or you believe it because, or whether you believe this because you've been convinced by medical evidence that there's a high probability that this behavior will lead to you catching STDs and some unwanted pregnancies, well, the result is the same. The behavior is the same, even though the content of the belief is radically different in that case. And here, it's also the same if you have an actually good understanding of Christian sexual ethics and theology, and not that distorted version I cited earlier. The behavior is actually the same whether you take any of these three belief contents. And so what these examples I'm giving here are driving at is, part of the point Plantinga and Churchland and all these other people are making is belief content. Natural selection doesn't care about that. It doesn't matter. What matters is the behavior. And you can wind up with the same behavior with multiple different types of belief content. So Plantinga gives the example, one of the examples he gives is there's a man and a tiger. Well, obviously in order to survive, the man has to get away from the tiger because the tiger wants to eat him. But the man doesn't necessarily have to believe that the tiger wants to eat him in order to get away. There's a near infinite number of beliefs, combination of beliefs the man could have that will lead to him getting away from the tiger. I think Plantinga said something like, maybe the man has resolved that he needs to keep his weight down, and he's convinced that every time the tiger appears it's a hallucination, but he's decided, every time I see that hallucination I'm going to go run a mile or two. Or maybe he's totally convinced that the tiger is a cuddly kitty and wants to pet it, but he's also has the belief that running away from the tiger is the best way to pet it. And you can think of a nearly infinite number of bizarre beliefs that would result in the adaptive behavior of getting away from the tiger. And the point that's being made here that I'm trying to get at, that Plantinga is getting at, is that belief is just invisible to evolution. What counts is your behavior. What natural selection looks for and adapts for is behavior in this sense, not belief. Your beliefs can be totally wrong, but if you do the right thing to get your body parts where they need to be to reproduce, natural selection and evolution just doesn't care. So, on naturalism and evolution, a belief may or may not be true, and hence, absent any other information we can look at to determine the probability of our cognitive faculties producing true beliefs, then we have to say it's something like 50-50. It could go one way, it could go the other way, we don't really know. But then, just stop and think about all the changes and variations that were necessary to produce human beings by evolution. Trillions of changes to genomes and little mutations here at the least. Quite likely much, much more. So, like bats, whales, and humans are all mammals, which means they all share some type of common ancestry according to traditional evolutionary theory. Think of all the changes that would have had to occur in order for humans to be differentiated from bats and whales. It's immense. And so, loosely speaking, when you bring cognitive faculties into the mix, at each one of these changes, there was something like a 50-50 chance that any belief that was produced was true. Now, try flipping a coin several trillion times and expecting it to come up heads about 95% of the time or better, and you should immediately see the problem. The chances that most of our beliefs turn out to be true comes out to be very, very low, just as the chances that the coin's going to come out heads most of the time is, again, very, very low. This is compounded by the fact that there are a lot more ways to believe wrongly than there are to believe something that's right. So for any given question, there's at least one right answer, and if it's a complicated or messy question, sometimes there can be more than one right answer, sometimes there can be a couple ones. But even then, there's a nearly infinite number of wrong answers. There's always a lot more ways to get it wrong than there is to get it right. And this is all made worse by the fact that naturalism typically entails materialism. So, if materialism is true, then beliefs must be something like a physical structure of the neurons in our brains. That is, materialism entails human beings have no immaterial components. The mind is completely reducible to the brain. So, it must be, your thoughts, your beliefs must be neurons firing in your brain. Now, you could say, perhaps given this type of materialism or naturalism, Our beliefs do cause behavior, and these beliefs are physical structures of those neurons and such in our brains, but this falls into the exact same problem I was alluding to before. Adaptive behavior / beliefs need not necessarily be true, and that coin example just demonstrates this. So even if you reduce the mind back to material, this doesn't get you out of the problem. But further, there's a point here that beliefs alone don't cause behavior. Rather, it's a combination of beliefs, desires, and the context we find ourselves in that do. The example that Plantinga gives of the man and the tiger illustrates this quite well. Well, the man has desires, he has beliefs about himself and the tiger, and then there's the context in which he finds himself seeing the tiger, and you can vary those a lot to some degree and wind up with the same result. Or another example, I mentioned at the start of this podcast that I'm suffering from a cold or maybe a touch of the flu right now. Well, typically when I feel sick this way, I actually feel physically cold, like my body can't get very warm, so I'll put on sweaters and a hat and things like that and try to keep myself warm. And I've noticed that the more I do this, it seems like the faster I get better, so I've just started doing it a lot. And I found out through my wife that there may actually be a little bit of evidence that increasing your body temperature makes it harder for some pathogens to reproduce. Hence, that's good adaptive behavior. Or at least, assume it is for the sake of this example. Well, what needs to happen then to increase my odds of survival and eventually reproducing is that I need to increase my body temperature to help keep the pathogen levels down, and so I do recover and then don't die from whatever pathogen's infecting me. Well, there's all kinds of ways that I could end up increasing my body temperature and getting warm. I don't necessarily have to believe, oh, I'm sick, I feel cold, therefore let me put on a bunch of sweaters and stuff like that. It could be that I have a belief that every time I get congestion, it's a case that there's water in my body that can't come out, and so the best solution is to bundle myself up so I heat up really a great deal and sweat it all out, so to speak. That would still have the same effect. I'd still have the same adaptive behavior. It could be that I have a desire to actually feel sick, for whatever weird reason that would be, and I, for whatever other reason, believe that bundling myself up in this way and wearing a sweater and a hat and things like that and essentially getting really warm will cause me to feel more sick, because so far every time when I felt sick, this is what I've done. And so on and so forth. I'm sure you can easily think of many other examples. There are lots of different belief, desire, and context mixes that will lead to the same action, and the action is the only thing natural selection and evolution cares about. Remember, there are a near infinite number of ways that our beliefs can be wrong, but there's typically only one way for them to be right. And while there probably aren't a near infinite number of ways for your beliefs to be wrong and then you to engage in the correct or adaptive behavior, the number is certainly much, much greater than one. I think a very conservative low-end estimate would be that there are at least thousands of false beliefs that will arrive at the same correct adaptive behavior for every one true belief that would do that. Just another example of this, at the last philosophy conference I was at, the Minnesota Philosophical Society's conference, a gentleman there was giving an essay arguing that by eating meat you do harm to the farmers because there's something wrong with eating meat and you're causing the farmers to have to kill the cattle, pigs, or whatever, and there's something morally wrong with that. And all of his reasoning was deductively valid. The only point where I really disagreed with him is he was just assuming from the get-go that animal life has more or less the same value as human life, and that's where it was wrong. Now, you could decide not to eat meat, or red meat specifically, for moral reasons like that guy did. Even though I think his moral reasons are fallacious, he was clearly taking that stance. Or you could read up in the relevant medical literature, which right now says, well, eating a lot of meat, and red meat specifically, is bad for your health, and then decide, I'm going to not eat red meat, I'm going to avoid it for that reason. Well, two very, very different beliefs that lead to the same behavior. You're not eating red meat, even though one time you're doing it for medical reasons based on data, and the other time you're doing it for moral reasons that I think are fallacious and wrong. a true belief leading you to avoid eating meat, and a wrong belief that leads you to avoid eating meat. Now, a criticism that's been made of the argument on this point comes from the philosopher Stephen Law, as he argues that there must be some type of a limit to the range as which actions and beliefs can coincide like that. That is, it can't just be that any old belief leads to any old action. There has to be some type of a limit. And I think he tends to be right on this, and you could maybe then pull back some of Plantinga's more outrageous examples, like the idea that the man wants to keep his weight down and thinks the tiger is a hallucination, and so is resolved to run a mile every time he sees the hallucination. That's a little more outlandish, but you're still, even if you have to pull it back a little bit, easily going to wind up with examples where there's clear causal connection and you can have a true belief and a false belief that lead to the same action, like I just talked about in the example of eating meat. So the point that I'm making here, the point of Plantinga's argument, is that holding to both evolution and naturalism is self-refuting because it turns around and makes everything we believe suspect. So, example by analogy, suppose someone convinces me that both of my alma mater schools, that is Evangel University and Holy Apostles College and Seminary, suppose somebody convinces me that they're both really, really bad schools. Now, they're not. They're both fantastic schools, but let's suppose this for the sake of argument. Well, if somebody convinced me of that, that would give me good cause or warrant to treat what I learned at those schools with some suspicion, because why should you trust what you learned if it was from a poor school? You have reason to doubt those kind of things. Or, again, a couple more examples by analogy here. Suppose you're a Republican and somebody manages to convince you that the only reason you or anyone else is a Republican is because you're greedy and racist. Well, now you have a defeater for every belief you formed on the basis of being a Republican. Or suppose something similar if you're a Democrat. Suppose somebody were to convince you that the only reason you or anybody else is a Democrat is because you're greedy and selfish and want to take everybody else's money. Well, then you've got a defeater for every belief you formed on the basis of being a Democrat. Or, just to continue the fun, let's bring this closer to home for me. Suppose someone were to convince me after I've had, way too much to drink or something, and I was more open-minded than I should be. Suppose somebody convinced me that the only reason I or anyone else would ever be a libertarian is for the smug satisfaction of feeling intellectually and morally superior to the Democrats and Republicans. Well, if I was convinced of that, then I should be very suspicious of all the beliefs that I've ever formed on the basis of being a libertarian. So these are good examples by analogy to help you, I think, get to the point of what's going on, but they all fail in one respect here, which is all these are specific examples, only in this area of politics or this area of education or something like that, whereas with evolution, naturalism, and our cognitive faculties, this is a universal problem. It would apply to every single belief you have. That is, don't just suppose this is about politics or education or something like this. Suppose somebody were able to convince you that your own mind did not work properly, that it really wasn't showing you what was actually going on. There's been some movies where this idea has been toyed with a little bit, where people are trying to convince somebody that they're insane, that they can't trust what they're seeing and perceiving. Well, if that's going on, and it's universal, you then have very good cause to doubt every single belief you ever have. If you're absolutely convinced that you're hallucinating things and you can't tell the distinction between the hallucinations and the real world, you then pretty much have to doubt everything, because anything could be a hallucination, which would be a horrifying thought, honestly. And that's where the evolutionary argument against naturalism puts you, because all of your beliefs are developed either by or through your cognitive faculties. And if evolution and naturalism are both true, then your cognitive faculties were designed to give you aid in survival of reproduction, not give you true beliefs. Then you're stuck in that similar situation. It's like everything you're seeing is a hallucination, because what your mind is telling you, what your cognitive faculties are telling you, what you're getting from your perceptions is, at this point, given evolution and naturalism, very well adapted to get you to survive long enough to reproduce. But that's not necessarily going to be the same thing as what's true. And as I alluded to before, there are lots of instances where false beliefs or mildly false beliefs are actually a greater aid to reproduction and survival than the true beliefs. If you're just mildly paranoid, not so paranoid that you never interact with people, but paranoid enough that you're suspicious of everyone, even though that's irrational, but you're that paranoid, and you're just completely filled with lust constantly, well, there's a much, much higher chance that you're going to survive long enough to reproduce than if you have true beliefs, which include the idea that you can probably trust most people most of the time in the absence of a reason to doubt them, and sexual desire is best expressed in a marriage relationship and with some sense of moderation. Well, that's not a belief that's very good for survival and reproduction. Well, at least not as good as the other one, even though the other one's wrong. Now, the most common objection I've heard to this argument simply misses the point, which is the most common one people make is, well, wouldn't actually having true beliefs be more adaptive in the long run? And the answer to that is, well, no, not necessarily, because people who ask that question are just falling back on assuming that our cognitive faculties are reliable, because that's how we tend to think, because that's how the world seems to work. And so they just kind of rebuff at this idea that our cognitive faculties aren't reliable. But what that should show you, if that's your initial thought, is, well, if our cognitive faculties are reliable, and this argument shows us that on naturalism and evolution we shouldn't expect them to be, then you should turn around and reject either naturalism or evolution, because the argument has shown there's something in the world that we wouldn't expect to see, that shouldn't be here if naturalism and evolution are true. And now there are other objections that are raised to this. I mentioned earlier that there's one possible exception to the definitions being right, and that's that some people who call themselves naturalists actually claim to believe in things that are like abstract, like minds and things like that. Stephen Law, a philosopher out of Britain, has said that he considers himself a naturalist, but he doesn't think this argument would apply to him. And that's just a case when you're dealing with professional philosophers that they tend to be very clever, so they'll find ways to nuance their definitions that are odd and unusual to get around things like this. But nonetheless, I find something very, very compelling about this argument. It may well be the case that there are better ways to express this, but I think the idea does fit very well that if evolution is true, and there is no God or nothing like God to guide the process and bring things along and bring it to some pinnacle or something along those lines, then we have good cause to doubt the beliefs we have, including our beliefs in evolution and naturalism. It kind of leads us into a case of ultimate skepticism where we just have to doubt everything. But at the same time, honestly speaking, virtually nobody who believes in evolution and is also a naturalist actually does doubt everything. And Plantinga says, well, they're just wrong. They haven't thought it through. They haven't considered the implications of this, and they need to do that. So that's the evolutionary argument against naturalism. As I said, you want to learn more about it. Easiest thing to do is just go on YouTube, type it in. You'll find Plantinga's lectures about it, other people talking about it. In my opinion, I think it's a very good argument. There's definitely something that he's getting at here that is worth considering, and I wouldn't be surprised if in another 30, 40, or 50 years some other people revise this, find better ways of articulating it that get around some of the technical issues some philosophers have pointed to, because there are some technical issues that philosophers have pointed to where they would say, well, it doesn't really apply here, or if we consider cognitive faculties in this sense, then it doesn't apply here. If we adopt a whole different theory of epistemology, it doesn't apply. But at the same time, there really does seem to be something here. And so I think this is a great argument, and I'd encourage you to think about it as well, and just consider, if your beliefs really were formed by a blind process that only cares about survival and reproduction, can you really trust them? I think no. So, tell me what you think about this. Write in and let me know. I'm always happy to get comments. I've been getting some more feedback from people, and it's wonderful. Hopefully I'll get a chance to read out some of the feedback next week. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or go to the Facebook page I started for the podcast, The Examined Life with Phil. Just type it in on Facebook and you'll find it. And to my knowledge now, you can find this podcast on pretty much all the major podcast services. So if you like what I'm doing, give it a like or a rating on whichever service you use and whatever's appropriate. Share it with other people so it can grow. And I'll be back again next week. I Still don't have I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing next week, but I will be doing something. So I'll talk to you again then.
Hi, everyone. Dr. John Aquaviva here, author, professor of exercise science, and host of Faith in Sport on WCAT Radio. Please join us as we discuss current events in the sports world, bring on inspiring guests, and discuss how our Catholic faith impacts all who are involved in sport, the athletes, the coaches, the referees, and yes, even the fans. So join me, Dr. John Aquaviva, as I discuss my two favorite topics, my faith and the world of sport, on the Faith in Sports Show here on WCAT Radio.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.